Good morning, everyone, and thanks very much for turning up. We've been waiting for this day to be able to demonstrate this tool to you all. I'm just going to give a quick overview. I think none of us are a stranger to the context for this, but it never does any harm to really set out that context again and think about the scale of the challenge that faces all of us. We know that the transport sector has performed especially badly in the UK, as it has done indeed in many developed countries. The transport sector in the UK is the only end-use energy sector whereby emissions are greater now than they were in 1990, and it's far exceeded other sectors to sit there on the top of the sector that accounts for the greatest amount of emissions. And we hear a lot about net zero, and of course that's what our Climate Change Act has set out for us as an economy-wide goal by 2050 to reach net zero. However, it's important to understand that within that act, within the budgets that have been set down by the Committee on Climate Change, surface transport is not one of the sectors that is earmarked for benefiting from any negative emissions technologies. Those negative emissions technologies, which in themselves are not certain to be developed at scale, to the extent that they are going to ride in and save us to any extent, they're being saved up for the aviation sector and the land use sector and not for the surface transport sector. That means that actually the language of net zero around most of the things that are dealt with at the local level is incorrect. It's about reaching absolute zero. So what that means in terms of a trajectory is that we need to rapidly switch away from a pathway of no reductions at all, which is what we've achieved essentially so far, to very, very sharp emissions reductions. And I've been involved in very many modelling exercises, as have many other people at different scales. We have modelled various scenario pathways for the sector at the national level, the Scottish level, regional levels. Many people have done this now in their local jurisdictions. And I have seen consistently that the rate of reduction that's required is anywhere between rate of reduction of carbon from transport, surface transport, is anywhere between 6 and 15% per annum from this year onwards. So that's a cumulative year-on-year reduction. And I often put that in context now of thinking about what was achieved, obviously under poorer circumstances last year under COVID, where we saw a 20% reduction in traffic overall across the year. We could equate that to carbon, and we need to achieve that almost every year or every couple of years and keep on doing it year on year. So everywhere has to act, nowhere gets a free pass, and if some places go more slowly, then by implication it's anticipated that other places will go even more quickly than the average of, say, 6% per annum.
Gillian, sorry, can I just stop you a second? Please, can we sort out the presentation slides? I don't know who is controlling these, but they keep clicking back and forth. Please, can we sort this out now before we go any further?
Okay, all right. I'm going to carry on regardless of the interest of time.
Karen, I've got Gillian's slides up, so I can share them, but somebody kicked me off.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on here. Right, great. That's fantastic.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Sorry.
The next slide after that, please, whoever's controlling it. And then that's what I've just been talking about, and then this one. Thank you very much. Okay, so I mentioned that lots and lots of local authorities have been doing these scenario analyses for themselves. This is an example of the West Yorkshire Combined Authority reductions pathway. And the ingredients on this slide are really incredibly ambitious. So we've got, setting out the reductions required in car travel and the targets for other modes of transport. When you look at the plan by West Yorkshire Combined Authority, there is still a significant carbon gap that they have realised that they need to fill, and are scratching their heads, as we all are, as to how we can possibly achieve these commitments. But as I say, there you see authority setting it out as a 21% reduction in car travel, and a very large increases in active travel. Next slide, please. We have done some analyses which has sat, if you like, next to the carbon calculator data that you're about to be presented with, that shows just the range of starting points that all the local authorities are starting at. So that's the real variation which we know about. This histogram shows the distribution of per capita emissions across all districts in the UK, so aggregating up to district level. And there's a variation of a factor of 5 between the highest and the lowest, and a very wide spread. And for lots of reasons which you'll all have a good understanding of, this starting point means that there are very different levels of ambition, very different prospects of what can be achieved, and very different ideas of what each local authority ought and could be responsible for. But our starting point for this carbon calculator is that without actually understanding and diagnosing where the carbon emissions are emanating from in each locality, and without really good sort of diagnostic information, it's going to be very difficult to set realistic carbon pathways. We know that over half of local authorities have declared a carbon emergency. The targets that are being set around that carbon emergency are very varied in and of themselves. Some of those targets relate to just the operations of the local authorities themselves. Others take on the whole transport sector. Others take on transport and other sectors as well. So no consistency in terms of the metrics that are being used, and in terms of the scale and rate of challenge that faces us all. In some work that we carried out for the Local Government Association, we started out with a series of workshops with local authorities to discuss exactly the issues that I've been talking about, what seemed to be the starting point, the ambition, where the balance of effort might lie. And self-evidently, the current ambitions and the current plans for carbon reduction are reflect these starting points, and when added up, are made up, comprised of very varied portfolios of solutions. So breaking things down very broadly into avoid, shift and improve solutions. So avoiding travel, shortening journey distances, more virtual working, shifting, so the modal shift type solutions that we are familiar with, and improvement, which is largely around improving the vehicles that are in our jurisdictions. Those are the main buckets in which we can place our policies, and the balance of effort across those buckets are necessarily going to be very different. But what they could be and should be, as I say, needs diagnostic information. So we have set out to develop this calculator, which will be, the data sources and so on will be explained to you in great detail. It covers more than just the transport sector, as you'll see. And we believe that this tool can be used for a whole variety of different parts of the process of setting the ambition and monitoring the ambition. So first of all, the data itself will enable good measurement of the baseline of the local carbon footprints and the relative contribution of the different sources of emissions across different sectors in the local area. That then hopefully will be useful information to identify the target areas and the sectors. So those areas that are emitting the most, those areas that are perhaps the most malleable. for monitoring any solutions, so as a baseline, and then monitoring as we go forward the progress and the hopefully deep carbon reductions. For benchmarking in comparison to other authorities. So given that this tool is based on data at the local level, the LSOA level, it's possible to use a number of different non-emission based data sources around demographics, topography, economic activity, and that could then allow different authorities to identify themselves with, if you like, to twin themselves with other places of similar composition in order to share experience and benchmark progress against. It could also be used as a prediction and scenario planning tool, given the basis of the data sources and other analyses that exist to help us understand what the projection of emissions might be if we were to pull different levers and different scenarios in terms of demographics going forward. And then finally, the nature of the tool, as you'll see, is very interactive and very open to use for public engagement tool, of which there's a lot of evidence now, given a lot of climate assemblies and other engagements that have been going forward, to show that the public respond very well to much greater understanding of where their neighbourhood, where their household, where their local area sits in relation to other places, and the sort of fairness agenda of who is doing what and who is responsible for what. And we think that this would lend itself very much to helping with those kind of conversations. Okay, so we got there in the end with the slides, which is great. Hopefully no more hitches with the technology. And now to pass you over to the really important stuff, which is from Malcolm. Thank you.
So thanks very much, Gillian. Thanks for that introduction. Yeah, so basically, let me just remind you that, yes, we will be sharing the slides. Yes, we will be recording the meeting, the whole meeting. And there will be time for question and answers at the end. But please, could you also sign up to the Slido if you want to ask questions, which is in the chat box and which is also at the bottom of the slides, which presumably someone's going to start sharing again now because we seem to have lost the share again. And I'll pass you over to Malcolm. Don't really understand why we keep coming in and out of sharing the slides. Thanks, Malcolm.
Right, hopefully everybody can see the tool now. So I'm going to do the, hopefully we've got all the tech problems out the way, and I will do the risky thing of a live tech demo. So this is the place-based carbon calculator. As you can see, that most of it is dominated by a big map of England, and it's an interactive map, and you can pan and zoom just like you would with any other web map. To help you navigate around the places, so you can see the sort of the main roads and place names appear, and we also give the option to show administrative boundaries. So, for example, I can turn on the local authority boundaries, or the wards, or the Westminster parliamentary constituencies, or the parishes. So hopefully that helps you navigate through the areas that are familiar to you. So I'll leave the local authority boundaries on because I think for most people here this will be the most useful. You can also use the search bar to search for a particular location, or in the top left here there's the Find My Location button, which will zoom you into your current location, and zoomed us to the University of Leeds. So I'll just zoom out a little bit so you can get an overview of the whole of Leeds. So the areas shown on this map are lower super output areas. If you've not come across those before, they're statistical neighbourhoods that were originally created for the census, and they're designed to have an average population between about 1,500 people and 3,000 people. This means in city centres they can be very small, but in rural areas they can be much larger, but they all have roughly the same population. And what this main map shows is the average carbon footprint per person for each LSOA. And because carbon footprints are a little bit abstract, they can be difficult to wrap your head round. What we've been doing is awarding areas a grade based on how they perform relative to the average LSOA. So areas that are better than average, we've awarded grades between A+ and C, and those are shown in blue. And places that are worse than average, higher carbon, are shown in red with grades from D to F. And areas that are just around average for England are shown in light yellow. So if I zoom in a little bit, we can see that this is the total emissions map. But for a particular policy, you might be interested in just focusing on a specific area of the carbon footprint. So, for example, we could look at just emissions from cars or emissions from gas heating or maybe electricity. I'm not going to show you all of these because there's lots of different options, but as well as options that show the parts of the carbon footprint, we also show other sort of context information. So, for example, for housing, the average energy performance certificate rating for each LSOA, or the average size of homes, which obviously has a big impact on energy consumption. And we also provide the LSOA area classification, which are produced by the Office for National Statistics. And these give you an idea of the social demographics of the area, so what kinds of people live in this area. So I'll put that back to the total emissions grade. And if we pick somewhere sort of in the city centre to give you an example, so clicking on any LSOA will bring up this pop-up report, which is customised for each LSOA and provides you lots of additional information. So on the left-hand side here, you see the sort of headline details, the total carbon footprint, its total grade, and the actual value in kilograms of CO2 equivalent per person, and then a breakdown of various parts of the carbon footprint along with their grades. That information is also repeated on the right-hand side in graphical form. And here you see the first column is the LSOA that you've just clicked on. Then the second column is the local authority average, then the England average, and then the average of areas with similar area classification. So the idea is this is a comparison of similar areas but in other parts of the country. And all these graphs are interactive, so you can mouse over them to get more information, and you can even toggle on and off parts of the graph by clicking on the legend. And this horizontal black line here shows where we need to be by the 6th carbon budget, which starts in 2032. So it gives you an idea of roughly where you need to get to over the next 10 years. And these reports, you can also scroll down and there's usually more information. For example, here there's an illustration of how the grades are awarded and what they mean. Across the top here, we have tabs which provide more background information. So, for example, if you were interested in housing, there's information on historical gas and electricity emissions, as well as information about housing types. The EPC tab has lots of information that's taken from the Energy Performance Certificate database. You have to be a little careful with this data because not every house has an Energy Performance Certificate, but in many places more than half do. And there's lots of information about the different parts of the house, so the walls, the floors, the heating, etc. As I said, I won't go through all of these because there are a lot of them. And then there's also information about transport, so historical information about car and van emissions, travel to work and travel to school behaviour, and so on. And the consumption tab has a little bit more information about how we calculate some of the emissions. And the general tab has information on population trends and also some more descriptive information about the social demographics from the Office of National Statistics. So this is quite a low carbon area. Just to show you the contrast, let's pick a high carbon area on the edge of Leeds. So you see here we've gone from A grades now to lots of Fs. But notice that it's not the same grade across the board. Different areas have different bits of their carbon footprint that are high or low, which should help you inform your policy decisions. And you can see here on the graph that this is a very high carbon area in comparison to local and national averages, and even similar affluent communities. The last thing I'll just show you is you can imagine with so much data, occasionally there are data problems or missing data. So here's just an example where we always provide all of the data. We think that's important for transparency. But in this particular area, there are some problems, some limitations with the data. And so you'll see here that the grade has been set to not available, and this warning message has been added to the top, just to draw your attention to, maybe there's something wrong in this area, and maybe you should think of what to do with it. To show you some of the other features, so I'm going to turn off the LSOAs now and show you some of the other features in the tool. So the first of these is the public transport stops. So this is a map of every public transport stop in Great Britain. And we've used a similar grading scheme, but this time to grade them on the frequency of service. We know a really important thing of getting people to switch to public transport and away from driving and high carbon modes is not just that you need a good network of stops, but you also need a frequent service that people can use. So you can see here there are some key routes through Leeds that are in blue and dark blue. That indicates a very frequent service, so that's good. But you can see you don't actually have to go far out of the centre of Leeds to see areas in yellow and orange and even some red areas, which indicates a very infrequent service. And you can even click on any of these stops and get a little bit of additional information. So if I turn the transport stops off, we can also show how the quality of public transport and the quality of transport infrastructure in general affects travel times. And this comes through in the 15-minute neighbourhoods layer. So you might have heard of 15-minute neighbourhoods. They're an idea that's being pioneered in Paris. The idea is that in a sustainable town or city, all the services you need on a regular basis, things like shops and schools and a pharmacist, a GP, are all within a 15-minute walk. And that's the goal Paris is using. But some other cities are using different goals. For example, Melbourne in Australia is targeting 20 minutes by public transport. They might sound quite similar, but they're actually very different targets. And the idea of this layer is that it allows you to have an idea about how these different transport options work in your area. So each of these dots is the population weighted centroid of an LSOA. And if you click on it, you get the 15-minute isochrones by different modes. So the green area is 15 minutes by walking. The blue area is 15 minutes by bicycle. The purple area is 15 minutes by walking and public transport combined. And the red area is 15 minutes by bicycle and public transport combined. And I should say for the bicycle isochrones, it basically assumes you've got either a folding bike or you're able to take your bike on the public transport, which might not always be true, but is probably something you should be aspiring to in your low carbon transitions. And you'll notice here this is a good example in that how in one axis the public transport appears to be working quite well. It's substantially extending the range that people can reach within 15 minutes. But perpendicular from that, you can see that there's a problem with the public transport network in Leeds. It's not providing the connectivity in this direction. And this varies a lot even within the same city. So if we pick another area over here, you can see that this area, although there is public transport here, and this is still very much urban Leeds, the public transport is not providing the connectivity to allow people to travel further than they could cycle in 15 minutes. And you can imagine that this varies even more when you start to look between different cities. So the last layer that I'm going to show you is the PCT route network. So this layer is taken from the propensity to cycle tool, I won't go into too much detail about how that tool works because there are links here to more information, and the tool itself has a good explanation. But what this layout shows is what cycling levels are at the moment and could be under several future scenarios of increased cycling uptake. And the idea of including it in the carbon calculator is that you can combine the insights you get from the PCT about where you should put cycling infrastructure and the insights from the 15-minute neighbourhoods and the transport stops to combine effectively public transport and cycling together. So in terms of the other parts of the tool, I will show you quickly. We have a local authorities report page. So this is very similar to the pop-up report for the LSOAs, except it's aggregated up to whole local authorities. So you can just choose your local authority from the drop-down list, and you'll see you'll get the same report with the similar tabs. But as I said, this is for whole local authorities rather than LSOAs. And the last page that I will show you is the data page. So the data page provides more information about how you can download the data and more information about the methods. There's licensing information, links to bulk downloads for bulk data, as well as lots of information about the main sources and, you know, where we've done more complicated analysis, links to more information. And I should say that all the data is free and open source to use on an Open Data Commons license, with the only condition that you attribute the source and say that you've used the place-based carbon calculator. So I'll bring us back to the main tool, and that concludes a very quick demo of the main features of the tool. But I will leave you with a final thought. So the things that local authorities are going to be particularly responsible for in terms of housing and local transport, as Gillian said, are the things that we need to completely decarbonise and largely need to be done by the end of the decade. And that means we have about 33,000 of these LSOA neighbourhoods that need to be decarbonised, and only about 3,000 days to do that in. So nationally, we need to be thinking about decarbonising 10 entire neighbourhoods per day. And for a mid-sized local authority, that translates to about one neighbourhood per month. So while it's great that local authorities are starting to think about their 2050 and their 2030 plans, it's really important actually to have a plan for next month and a plan for tomorrow, because that's the speed that we need to be moving at. So I'm going to stop there and hand back to Karen.
Thanks very much, Malcolm. That was really, really interesting. And of course, the thing that everybody's asking is, how do I get the tool? So maybe even right now, for these impatient ones, could we put the link into the chat, please, for accessing the tool?
Yeah,
and then
do that.
Thanks, Malcolm. That's great. And then without further ado, and hopefully with the slides coming up very, very quickly, I'm going to introduce Mark Vallely, who is from Transport for the South East, and he's going to talk a little bit from his perspective, obviously strategically, but also from a district level in terms of district application, how the tool could actually help local authorities meet their carbon reduction goals. So thanks very much, Mark. Thanks for attending and thanks for your presentation.
Karen, good morning, everybody. Can you just confirm that you can see the slides?
Yes, we can.
Good. I'll just put it, and it's now in slideshow mode. Are we now in slideshow mode?
No,
No, I still see the edit mode.
Yes, still in edit mode. Thank you. And Mark, could you put your camera on?
It is on.
It is on.
Have we got it in? Have we got it in? Are we in slideshow mode now? Yeah.
Yes. Yes, we are.
We are. Good. We're all good to go then. Good morning, everybody. My name's Mark Vallely from Transport for the South East. And what I'm going to do today is to show you how we can potentially use the tool to help us, particularly in formulating our action plans to meet carbon reduction goals. Now, what I'm going to do is use a transport example. As Malcolm has demonstrated, there's a rich set of information in the tool, but I'm going to go down a transport avenue because that's the bit of the sector that I'm particularly concerned with. Just very quickly, Transport for the South East is one of 7 subnational transport bodies that are covering all of England. Our mission, very broadly, is to identify the large-scale transport improvements that will deliver sustainable economic growth. And this map just shows the geography that we cover. We represent 16 local transport authorities within that area. And part of our vision statement is we've adopted the government target of achieving net zero by 2050. But like many of you in the audience today, the thing that we're currently focused on is what's the trajectory to that point. As Gillian's already illustrated, the journey is more important than the arrival point. So what I'd like to say, Gillian in her presentation just highlighted a number of particular uses for the tool. I'm just going to focus today on 2 areas, which is about identifying target areas and sectors and the benchmarking aspect, particularly focusing when we're thinking about developing our action plans to decarbonise locally, about how the tool can potentially help us. So what I want to do is just focus within my geography, just use an illustrative example of comparing Wealdon district, a rural district with a population of about 160,000 people in various small towns and villages, compared to coastal urban area of Eastbourne with a population of about 100,000. Now, just looking at the estimated annual carbon footprint, we can start to see some patterns starting to emerge. But as Gillian's identified in her talk, everyone is starting from a very different place, and we can see even within this area, we've got quite contrasting levels of average emissions from within those places, and even within Eastbourne as an urban area, there's quite contrasting levels of emissions. And as Malcolm's identified, what the tool enables us to do is to compare a particular district. So here we're looking at Eastbourne compared to the England average, and just see how its carbon footprint is comprised and how it compares overall, and how the different sectors compare. So we can see here that the number of flights taken by people in Eastbourne is significantly lower than the English average. And just sort of generally, you can see that for many of the segments here, which are shown across the top of the slide, Eastbourne has lower levels of emissions across the board. If we start to look and delve a little bit more into the transport area, just looking at Eastbourne's carbon emissions from cars and vans, you can see it's lower than the England average. We compare that with the Wealdon district, the rural area, though, you can see quite markedly that has far higher levels of emissions from cars and vans. Well, and this is the sort of pattern that we would expect. Just delving in a little bit more, the tool enables us to, and Malcolm's put some very useful data in there that enables us to compare the levels of travel to work trip share as one example. And here we can see the pie charts show us the proportion of people travelling to work by different modes. And as we would expect, comparing a rural and an urban area, we can see that Eastbourne has a far lower levels of commuting by car and van, shown in red, than Wealdon district. But we can also start to sort of see some thinking about our action planning. This is usefully showing us sort of what people do at the moment. And we can see within Eastbourne, we've got far higher levels of people cycling, walking. But by contrast, if we look to Wealdon, we can see a far more significant proportion of the people are working from home. And obviously, this is something to think about when we're thinking about our action planning. What is our ability to maybe capitalise on that? Just if you're wondering about the segment shown around the outside of the pie chart, this is data from the tool, the propensity to cycle tool that Malcolm referenced, which shows the potential propensity of people in those 2 areas to cycle. So the green segment, the light green segment, shows in the future what the propensity of people living in those 2 areas to cycle may well be. And you can see we've got unsurprisingly, a far higher propensity to cycle in Eastbourne compared to the real rural Wealden district. So just going back out, zooming back out, just looking at the overall carbon footprint, as I sort of said, we're very contrasting patterns of use across the area, and different levels of emissions. But if we delve into the whole the area of car and vans again, we start to see some sort of clear patterns emerging, and a contrast between generally rural area and urban Eastbourne. Far lower levels of emissions from cars in Eastbourne compared generally to the Wealden district, the rural area. Now, just to zoom in a little bit more and just sort of see how we can start to then focus and think about these different areas. You can see within the middle area there is some sort of quite contrasting levels of emissions from car use. So we have the ability, just zooming in on that area, to zoom in at these three interesting LSOAs as to why there are these contrasting levels of emissions from car use. And as Malcolm sort of has illustrated, the tool enables us to look at the ONS classification of those areas, and we can see, or I wouldn't suggest that the pictures will appear, but just to give you a flavour of what these two contrasting, the dark red area and the light blue area, they have different ONS classifications. So ageing rural neighbourhoods, the light blue, prospering countryside life, the dark red, which starts to sort of give us the information about potentially why we're seeing these different levels of car use. As Malcolm said, we can delve down and look at frequency of public transport use at stops. And as he said, there's the grading system to look at the frequency of stops. Now, if we look at, there are bus services in both the dark red LSOA and the light blue. But if we look at the frequency of those stops, all of them in the dark red area classified as worst performing. Some of the worst performing, you can see this one only has 5 stops per week. It's a school service which is available to members of the public. But by contrast, if we look into the light blue area, we can see that this has the bus stop here, this particular one, a far higher level of service. And obviously, looking at this information and thinking about the sort of the concept that Gillian introduced of avoid, shift, improve, the sort of information that the tool is providing us with is enabling us to think about in our action planning the different sorts of emphasis that we need to play on these 3 pillars of this in those different areas, with clearly potentially the need to think in rural areas about the need, more emphasis on the need to avoid and reduce the need to travel. We saw that there's more home working already in the rural area, rural Wealden compared to Eastbourne. Maybe we need to capitalise on that. The shift to environmentally friendly modes. So thinking about is there potential? There is a bus service in those areas. Is there the potential to increase the frequency of that and get more people travelling using the bus? Or is it the case on the improved side that with the high levels of car use, our focus has got to be in this rural context on potentially emphasising the need to shift to EVs as one of the sort of the central pillars of what we do. So there we are, just a quick run through of some of the information in the tool and how it may help us formulate our thinking about our action plans to help us decarbonise within our local areas. And I'll finish it there.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much, Mark. That's really comprehensive. I think given the short amount of time, I think we can get some insights from that. So I think we'll stop sharing the slides now and focus on the panel. Panel members, if everyone else could have their cameras off, that would be helpful. On the panel, Gillian, who presented first, for any of you who joined us late, Malcolm, who developed the tool, Mark, who's just shown you some application of it, Stephen Bishop, who's working within Steer Davis Steer, and will be able to talk a little bit about the use of the tool in terms of the consultancy application. So we'll be fielding questions from the Slido. So if you could put your questions in there now, the number is at the bottom, the link is there at the bottom of the slides. And basically, I'm going to go through some of the data, some of the questions that have already been asked, and ask them of various different people. I think, Malcolm, to kick us off, because we had so many questions about where does the data come from, when will it be updated? Is it freely available? And all of those sorts of basic questions. I mean, maybe you could just sort of say out loud where the data is, maybe share it again on the chat where the tool is, and just sort of talk a little bit about updates.
Yes, so there's lots of questions there. So yes, the data is publicly available, free to use. People have got the link to the tool now, www.carbon.place, and if you click on the data tab at the top, it gives you lots more information about where the data's come. So I won't go into the specifics about every single data set. Essentially, it's a patchwork quilt of data sets. Some data is things like gas and electricity consumption is very easy to get. Myself and Gillian and others have done a lot of work on the transport data. And then some data, things like consumption of goods and services, are much harder to get really local data for. So there's a degree of modelling and downscaling national data to a local level based on survey information and information on things like household income. So it is quite a complicated patchwork quilt. Something I also didn't say in the presentation is that all the source code that was used for the analysis is also published as open source. So if you're interested in the exact weightings and methodologies and things, you can look at the source code. And I'm also very happy to take emails and things with specific technical questions. In terms of is it going to be updated? That is our hope. We don't currently have funding to update it. So at the moment, the tool represents a single snapshot for 2018. The reason we use 2018 is it's the most recent year that all the different data sets are available for. So some data sets like gas and electricity we have up to 2020 already, but some other data sets aren't updated that frequently. So 2018 is the most recent year we can do a comprehensive carbon footprint for. But the hope is that we would be able to update that in the future if we can secure additional funding. And for local authorities and things, if you like the tool, I've seen quite a few positive comments in the chat. It's really helpful if you tell us that, because then we can turn around to the funders and to national government and say this is something local authorities want and need, and that can build a case for funding.
Great, thank you, Malcolm. Gillian, could I bring you in here and just sort of say to you a little bit about you talked at the beginning about the different uses of the tool, but who are you thinking are the target audiences for this tool? I mean, obviously there are a lot of local authorities here that might use the tool in their policy development and plan development as we go forward. But how about, for example, the fact that it's quite residentially based? Is there anything, is there an intention to have just that residential focus?
I think, as I said, I think it's really, I think we can see, given the breadth of the sources of data and the different geographical scales at which you can look at it, I think it's going to be relevant for anyone that's involved in the carbon reduction agenda. So that's going to be those that are planning, those that those that are responsible for policy at local level, but also those that are interested in understanding, maybe lobbying, maybe trying to galvanise local support, whether it's from businesses or other publics, as we should say. It's obviously public engagement is a sort of meaningless term in the sense that what does it mean? And certainly we haven't yet had the opportunity to bring this tool to any kind of public engagement activity, but I think that it could be used again at very different scales. It could be used, it could be used with school children, maybe. Obviously, it's very complicated, but in terms of, basic geographical understanding of where you live and the types of activities that are going on around you and what that results in terms of relative impacts. It could be used in public consultations about whether it's housing, whether it's transport related agendas. So sorry, it's a bit of a broad term, but I think everybody can see that it's got probably lots of different things for different audiences.
That's great, thank you, Gillian. Mark, one of the questions that came up in the Slido was how do you communicate to the sort of politicians that not all areas need to be targeted, and that in fact therefore you might need to put different resources into different places, and obviously the rural areas will always be more of a challenge, but perhaps also more difficult in terms of putting in viable public transport options and so forth. Could you talk a little bit about maybe some of the options that might be available in that high red area that you showed in Wealden, in terms of trying to decarbonise that, where everyone's very car dependent?
Well, I think that, you know, as we've seen, the tool is really powerful in terms of showing information visually, and obviously when communicating with some of our politicians, having the ability to show the information directly in that way is really extremely helpful. And I would also say, when we're having conversations with members of the public about our action plan development, the tool is going to be very useful in illustrating to people in particular communities why the drivers, the drivers of our action plan have to be as they are, and why there are different things that need to happen in different areas. So I think just the simple mapping of the information in this way is extremely powerful, and enables us to communicate more effectively with different audiences. As I showed in the quick exposition of an area not too far from where I live, there are some particularly in rural areas, there are some real challenges on the decarbonisation agenda. But as I showed, the tool does sort of point us to targeting our actions to think about those things which are, particularly in a rural context, we might have to think more about, improved digital connectivity to increase the propensity of people to work from home, and encouraging the shift to EVs. As I know that isn't part of the solution, there are other things that are needed, but in a rural context, we can see very much the high levels of car ownership that there are there. Our ability to shift to cycling and walking is far less reduced, given the distances that people have to travel. So it gives a different emphasis maybe to what we need to do in the rural areas compared to urban.
Great. Stephen, could I bring you in here and just sort of say, how would you imagine? I mean, I know that obviously Steer does a lot of work with local authorities all around the country to help them develop their transport plans. And I wondered how you could imagine sort of using the tool in that applied context.
Yeah, thanks, Karen, and good morning, everyone. I think this is quite a key tool now, and I hope it can become quite ubiquitous in its use. But I think having this richness of evidence and it brought together, and some of the comparisons and trade-offs that are shown with that data is really helpful for developing the evidence basis for policy and strategy development. I think Gillian mentioned it when she had that graph of the kind of 5 times variability in carbon emissions. Having that insight at an LSOA level or different geographical scales starts to then really identify where effort should be focused. Of course, there's a role for national policy and regulation, but that idea that one size does not fit all, which I think takes into perhaps the most important areas with community engagement. There are some questions on the Teams chat as well about what can we do to galvanize public buy-in, to remove some of those barriers to change. I think, I don't know, maybe I'm a bit of a geek, but we all love maps, and I think a lot of people are probably already typing in home postcodes or other things like that. I think these sorts of tools can really focus people's attention and effort. There's almost a bit of a gamification to it. No one wants to get the F-, everyone wants to see it. So I think it also points to being able to update the data, look at trends, look at potential as well as the baselining aspects. But I guess a bit more bluntly, I think not only community engagement, I think there's a case for sort of advocacy whether that's within the local community, to politicians, whether that's up to central government. I think possibly there's an interesting idea about whether it could be used with developers in some way if we move towards seeking developer contributions, not just around kind of traffic flow and congestion, but actually around some sense of carbon budget or quotas. That could be interesting. And I think finally, things like business case development and funding bids, this could be really helpful, and not least sharing good practice. So a bit of a rambling answer. I'm excited
that's great.
about
I think
this.
that's really, really useful. Thank you very much for that. I mean, I think if we went through the list that Gillian put up in the beginning, for me, the monitoring function, I mean, the baseline function is obviously there. Where are we now? Or where were we in 2018? And of course, there is a huge amount of other data that could be added in terms of people have been asking about what about air quality and how does this link with the BICE data sets and so on and so forth. But I think that sort of idea about monitoring obviously does require that this tool does get updated, and we can come back to that in a minute. Similarly, there were lots of questions about Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, because we always seem to do this for England. And again, it's to do with the availability of data sets, but not without the realms of possibility. But one of the things I really like is the benchmarking bit of it, because it's sort of particularly that idea that you can sort of compare it with like. And I just wondered like how that conversation goes, Stephen, when you're trying to, sort of talk to you're being engaged as a consultant for a local authority, and they're like, oh, well, we can't do anything. And you're like, well, hang on a minute, this area is like yours, and, this is what can be done. Those difficult questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think being able to select by ONS output area classification really helps facilitate the comparison on areas that share similar place and socio-demographic type characteristics. There was a question or comment about could it not be using sort of things like Acorn or Mosaic data. But I think if we want this to remain sort of open source and free, that's some of the limitations of that. I think it's extremely helpful. People get a bit bored of being compared to Cambridge, for example, when we're talking about cycling mode shares. I gave a little demo to the team, apologies Malcolm, yesterday, and so I said no one wants to be too London centric, but I'd clicked on a LSA called Little London in Leeds. But I think having those comparisons are extremely helpful. Where I'd like to see this go next, if the funding's available, is looking at that benchmarking in terms of potential. So what are the characteristics of those areas that are doing better than their kind of like for like areas? I think that's extremely powerful in engagement. You're going to turn leaders off if you always compare things to central London or Cambridge or irrelevant, effectively, areas.
Yeah, I mean, you could literally compare neighbourhoods to neighbourhoods, and you could literally talk about, well, these areas, these are all rural areas, but actually some rural areas are doing better. I wonder whether it's almost like a capacity building tool, Gillian, that you could use to bring different sort of groups of authorities together where they know they've got a specific type of problem, and then sort of lobby government at the national level. Hang on a minute, look, we've all got this same problem with, I don't know, high reliance on cars in rural areas. We need something more strategic to happen at the national level.
I think so. I think, as I think you were inferring, it's not going to work so well to have use it as a blame game tool and sort of, look how good I am compared to you, or, look how bad you are. But there is a real positive element, which is the sharing of experience and shared understanding of the problems, and as you say, maybe then shared strategies, and then sharing experience, best practice, etc., and developing networks. I think, as well as what's just been said about not wanting to always compare to Cambridge, to London, etc., I really see the whole rural versus urban sort of what would you call it? Passing the buck a little bit that happens in this debate, and whereby rural areas in particular say, well, we can't do it, we haven't got any of this, we can't, we've got to leave this all to the urban areas with better public transport and walking and cycling opportunities. Well, the fact of the matter is that doesn't cut it in terms of the carbon agenda. Everywhere has to act, and hopefully this type of tool will enable rural areas to compare themselves to rural areas and figure out what can be done much more constructively.
Yeah, I was also thinking, you know, it's a great way to argue with, for example, the Ministry of Housing and Local Government around the siting of houses, because in fact what's happening is we're putting all our new houses in these more peripheral places where public transport is awful, and then telling people not to use their cars. And so I think there's some quite big discussions that can be had between the business, the business department, the BICE, and DCLG and DFT and so forth, to try and bring those things together, because clearly what we're doing now is compartmentalizing it according to transport or housing or whatever. And this, I like the way that this tool brings it all together.
Yeah.
And Mark, at the level of your local authority, would you also say that you would be able to use this as a sort of like discussion point tool with people that are not just related to transport, but also the housing development plans and sort of regional planning?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, as we've identified, it can be used in a number of different contexts. I mean, the bit that we haven't explored today is the whole home heating challenge, which I think the tool really illustrates really well some of the challenges around home heating and moving forward, and talking to developers about when thinking about new homes and new installation of new homes, the reasons why we need to move forward very quickly on the whole home heating issue, which again in rural areas is a really significant challenge, given that many homes rely on oil-fired heating. So yes, I think it helps us in those conversations again with members of the public, about home heating and how things need to change, but also thinking about developers and how we influence new housing stock coming on stream, and the need to think about different ways of heating our homes.